Please welcome back President and CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Kris Sarri.
Hello, everyone. I hope everybody had a great lunch. Our next panel is called Wild Waters, and it is about the America the Beautiful initiative, which is a signature initiative of the Biden administration to conserve 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030, address climate change impacts, and ensure more equitable access to nature and its resources. This panel is going to be exploring those goals from a number of different perspectives, and I think you're going to enjoy it. We have such tremendous speakers. First, it is my honor to introduce Sean Cosgrove, who's with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, to offer some opening remarks. The Moore Foundation is one of our signature sponsors here at CHOW 2022 and is a strong advocate for marine conservation in the U.S. and across the globe. So with that, let me invite Sean to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy World Oceans Day. It's great to be here and be part of this ocean celebration. The Moore Foundation has been able to support the Capitol Hill Oceans Week for a number of years, and of course this year we're particularly happy to be sponsors of Capitol Hill Oceans Week and this panel. I want to thank Kris Sarri, first of all, and the hardworking staff who put on such a great conference and a wonderful ocean prom for those of you who were able to go last night. So about 50 years ago, a real ocean champion, President Nixon, signed legislation to protect and sustain our oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes through the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act. As originally enacted, Title III of this act permitted the Secretary of Commerce to designate as marine sanctuaries those areas of the oceans, coastal, and other waters which he determines necessary for the purpose of preserving or restoring such areas for their conservation, recreational, ecological, or aesthetic values. So since 1972, we've seen increased human uses, climate change, and climate-related impacts start to fundamentally change our ocean as biodiversity loss weakens ecosystems and their ability to withstand stressors. But we're at a historic moment now. With the bold leadership of President Biden's national policy on 30 by 30 and the America the Beautiful initiative, we can meet this challenge. By establishing new national marine sanctuaries, such as the Heart of the Ocean Pribilof Islands Marine Ecosystem Initiative, which is being led by the Aleut community of St. Paul, we can provide new and future generations, Aleut people and visitors, the experience and benefits of a productive and fascinating ocean ecosystem. Another way to reach the goals of the America the Beautiful initiative is to strengthen habitat protection in existing sanctuaries. So one of my favorite places, Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, was established in 1992. And since then, the sanctuaries carried the burden of intensive commercial fishing. In fact, NOAA's 2020 condition report for Stellwagen Bank documents widespread depletion of marine wildlife, benthic and acoustic habitat degradation, degradation of maritime heritage resources, and a compromised ability of the sanctuary to provide food for people. The sanctuary's condition report says that there's been, quote, measurable degradation of habitat quality, unquote, over the past decade. However, the Substantive Management Plan proposes no actions to address this obvious decline in ecosystem health. We do have a wonderful national marine sanctuary system, thanks in part to the foresight acted on 50 years ago. Now is the time for bold and courageous leadership to install the meaningful and lasting protections that our ocean ecosystems need and that our sanctuaries deserve. NOAA should seek to protect the marine wildlife and habitat of Stellwagen Bank, Florida Keys, and other existing sanctuaries with meaningful, lasting habitat protection. And we look forward to working with them to help accomplish this. So thank you for taking the time to be here today. I look forward to the discussion and the recommendations from this exceptional panel. And thank you again to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And thank you to the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries for their good work in meeting this challenge.
Thank you, Sean, so much. I appreciate it, and really thank the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for being a longtime sponsor of CHOW, and particularly of this panel. Now, please welcome our moderator for this panel, Dr. Anna Spalding. Anna is an associate professor of marine and coastal policy at Oregon State University and a research associate at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and Coiba Research Station in Panama. Her research encompasses the human dimensions of the marine environment, and she also served on the CHOW Advisory Committee this year and was a great voice for us. She helped the foundation as we guided the program together and worked on the agenda. So, Anna, thanks for all your support. We really appreciate it, and thank you very much for moderating this panel, and we'll invite the panelists to join as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Cosgrove and the Moore Foundation for your leadership and support of protected waters and the communities that rely upon and enjoy them. And thanks, Kris, for inviting me to moderate this fantastic panel. So as Kris said, my name is Anna Spalding. I'm a professor of marine and coastal policy at Oregon State University and a research associate at the Smithsonian in Panama. I'll be moderating the great session, and I'll introduce the session first, and then we'll have some leading remarks by Dr. Spinrad. So in May of 2021, the Biden administration launched America the Beautiful, the decade-long challenge to pursue a locally led, nationwide effort to conserve, connect, and restore our nation's lands and waters. America the Beautiful supports collaborative and inclusive conservation approaches for the benefit of all people, using science as a guide for protecting biodiversity, honoring tribal sovereignty and priorities, as well as pursuing restoration and conservation efforts that create jobs and support healthy communities. As we all know and have heard throughout the presentations yesterday and this morning, it's really important to bring people first into conservation. Our session today brings together scientific experts, federal agency leadership, and community conservation leaders to discuss how we can advance actions on America the Beautiful to understand the current status of protections in the marine environment, as well as gaps in representation, right? Some of us call that the what and the where, and how we can improve and thoughtfully and inclusively strengthen protections to achieve our goals. And this is what some of us call the how. Those actions that hopefully our speakers will discuss include supporting co-design and co-management, engaging with communities and addressing inequities, and measuring progress and benefits for biodiversity protection, climate resilience, and communities. Our panelists today are Dr. Kirsten Grover-Colvert. She's a professor at Oregon State University. We have Sarah Wolfson, a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian. Dr. Rick Spinrad, Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and NOAA Administrator from the U.S. Department of Commerce. Shannon Estenoz, Assistant Secretary, Fish and Wildlife and Parks, U.S. Department of the Interior. Naya Lewis, who we heard from yesterday, founder of Salted Logic and Director of Big Ocean. And Dr. Jenny de la Hoz, Vice President of Education at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So about the panel, we'll start the session with some remarks from Dr. Spinrad, followed by targeted questions for each of our fantastic panelists. They will each have about 3 minutes after the remarks. And then we'll have some targeted questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So, Dr. Spinrad, please.
Thank you for that introduction, Anna, and good afternoon to everyone. It really is great to share the stage with this prestigious group. Thank you so much for being part of it, and to be with you here in person. It's been quite a while for me to be back at CHOW, especially in person, and it's a real treat here to be able to share a couple of minutes with you. I know many of the faces in the crowd, and from my previous roles at NOAA, I am a NOAA recidivist, for those of you who know a little bit about my career. I really am honored to be here as administrator, and thank you for having me. As many of you know, conservation is woven into so much of our work at NOAA, and as you already heard, it's a key focus of the Biden-Harris administration. Today's theme of wild waters is an important opportunity for me to dive into a little bit deeper and to provide some aspects of the Biden-Harris America the Beautiful initiative in recognizing that nature is essential to the health, well-being, and prosperity of all Americans. President Biden issued a call a call to action to all Americans to work together to enhance our economy, our health, and our well-being by conserving, connecting, and restoring at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. NOAA is leading America the Beautiful in America's oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes, and we're doing it in a stakeholder-driven way through public roundtables, meetings, and partners and stakeholders, and accepting formal public comment throughout the process on how we should use our existing authorities to achieve the goals of this initiative. National marine sanctuaries, national estuarine research reserves, in particular, are really incredibly important tools to protect our oceans, our coasts, their ecosystems, which support our economies and enable global commerce, provide a vital source of food, and countless other intrinsic benefits. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, as well as many other critical, seminal pieces of legislation. So we now have over 620,000 square miles of protected waters in sanctuary system, thanks to the efforts of many of the people here in this room, many people who have been part of CHOW for many years, and that have supported NOAA and our Office of National Marine Sanctuaries along the way. It's also the 50th anniversary of the Coastal Zone Management Act, which authorized the NER, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. I will tell you that one of the first events I attended when I came on board after my confirmation was the designation of our newest National Marine Sanctuary, the Wisconsin Shipwreck National Marine Sanctuary, designated last August. And then just a few weeks ago, I had the privilege to travel to Connecticut to celebrate the designation of the 30th National Estuarine Research Reserve, which was officially designated in January. But we have to keep asking ourselves the question of how do we strengthen our conservation programs, not only the quantity of lands and waters conserved, but also the quality of the conservation as well. And this is a global effort. Many of us here in the audience had the opportunity to be at the Our Ocean Conference in Palau, where we discussed extensively the role of MPAs, and it'll be a key focus point for the upcoming United Nations Ocean Conference in Lisbon in a few weeks. So let me get to the meat of the matter and talk about two very specific announcements. Many of you have already heard that we have some exciting announcements today that directly relate to this call of action. I am so proud to be a participant here and share with you these actions that are due to considerable efforts of several individuals here today. First, we are absolutely delighted and excited to announce that we've begun the designation process for the potential National Marine Sanctuary in the Hudson Canyon area, approximately 100 miles offshore of New York City and New Jersey. Please. This proposal is based on a nomination from the Wildlife Conservation Society with broad community support, which we accepted into the inventory in February of 2017. And during the initial scoping phase, we'll collect input on potential boundaries, the location, the nature, the value of natural and cultural resources in the area under consideration, specific threats to these resources, information on the indigenous and tribal heritage of the area, the regulatory framework most appropriate for management of the proposed sanctuary, and a permanent name for the proposed sanctuary. So we have 4 sanctuary designation processes underway, in addition to the proposed Chumash Heritage Sanctuary off the coast of Central California. Very good, absolutely. The sanctuary designation process for Papahanaumakuakea. Let's get an applause there. And the proposed Lake Ontario Sanctuary. I am also really excited to announce the culmination of great efforts by the Aleut community of St. Paul, Alaska, as we accept Alagum Kano, known as the Heart of the Ocean, into our inventory of successful sanctuary nominations. It goes without saying that this nomination represents immense collaboration and potential to explore new models of indigenous co-management. And I would like to take this opportunity to invite the following people to stand and be recognized for the community effort and dedication it took to make these actions possible. If you're here with us, representatives from the Wildlife Conservation Society, John Calvelli, thank you, John, Noah Chesnin, Mary Tammy, Colin Sheldon for Hudson Canyon. Thank you. From the Aleut community of St. Paul for Allegheny Canoe, Marissa Merkuliev and Lauren Devine. Are you with us? Thank you. And any of others that I might have missed, please feel free to stand as well. There are many people out in the field, in the communities. We extend our deepest gratitude for all of the hard work. It's your exhaustive efforts that have helped make these critical steps for national marine sanctuaries possible. The progress related to these unique marine spaces doesn't belong to NOAA alone, obviously, and it is truly a partnership between our state, federal, tribal, non-governmental partners, only possible because of the diverse strengths and perspectives you bring to the process. So thank you for obliging me a little bit of time to make these really critical announcements. We are so happy to use the stage here at CHOW to make these announcements. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you. That is a wonderful way to start our session. I think there's lots of things to discuss here and think about. Now we actually have to get to work and get all these things working. So as I said earlier, we're going to start with, I'm going to start with some targeted questions to our panelists as a way of having them introduce themselves, what got them to where they are now, and a little bit about what they're doing. So I'm going to start with Kirsten, a dear friend. So what motivates you to participate in these conversations as a scientist and marine ecologist? And you have 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here. As a marine ecologist, I'm at Oregon State University. I think about, first of all, here on World Oceans Day, sharing some pictures of these amazing spaces, like as we all think the last time that we were in the water or under the water, you know, whether it's the coral reefs of the Florida Keys, whether it's the cold and offshore waters of Oregon. That's where I currently live and work, from the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people. And it's not only about these amazing ocean spaces, as we've been hearing, but also the communities, the indigenous leaders who are and have been stewarding these spaces for thousands of years, and the local communities, and all the ways that these systems protect and sustain. And these are key to their livelihoods and lifeways. And so when we think about the goals of America the Beautiful, climate resilience, biodiversity conservation, access to these resources that is equitable, you know, we're going to need a lot of tools, and a lot of people have come to the table to use those tools. And so the 30 by 30 specifically, you know, one of those tools that we're going to be talking about, and we are talking about, are marine protected areas. And marine protected areas are unique in that they're the only area-based tool that has, by definition, biodiversity conservation as the primary goal. And so that creates this question around how can MPAs be useful? What do we need to know about them? And we do have a lot of information about MPAs around the world and in the US. In the US, we have more than 1,000 marine protected areas. Incredible investment by our country, and we've been studying them for decades, so we know quite a lot about what happens inside and outside of MPAs. So we know a lot, but we also know that we need to, in thinking about the 30%, certainly there's lines on a map, we can tally up the total area of how much is protected, but the real question is how effective are those areas? Are they effectively conserving? And so as part of the work that I've been collaborating on over the past years, we published it last year called the MPA Guide. We've been looking across the research that exists, the different knowledge base about what MPAs can do, and thinking about what do we really need to know to track their effectiveness. And that effectiveness can take different forms, but essentially, when we started this process, collaborative with more than 100 ocean experts around the world, just asking, what do you think we really need to know about whether or not an MPA is effective? How do we track that? What we came up with, and we published last fall, is these 4 key elements. And the first is the stage of establishment, because we know that there are different steps in the process to create an MPA. Dr. Spinrad just announced a couple of those steps. And it's an incredible process that takes time. So the stage of establishment helps to track at what step it's in. And as they move towards active management, right, with monitoring, collaboration, engagement, which step are we in? The second is the level of protection, and that's because we know that MPAs are different. There's many different types of MPAs, and there's different types of activities that are allowed or not allowed within them, and as a result, different types of impacts. And so by tracking level of protection, we can get to the point of really seeing if sites are fully protected or maybe minimally protected, so that we can look towards their contribution to biodiversity conservation. And then the enabling conditions are these, to Anna's point, the who and the how. All the different parts of the process of establishing an MPA that are really critical for it to be successful. And so we think about the America the Beautiful 8 guiding principles. These are the enabling conditions, that they be inclusive and collaborative, transparent conversations, accountability, that there's capacity and political will. All those pieces, we need to be able to track those as well. And those 3 elements underpin this idea of what social and ecological outcomes we are hoping for and what we're setting our MPAs up to be successful to achieve. So not only biodiversity, more species, bigger individuals, more reproductive output, but what they're contributing to human well-being as well, and what are the social outcomes. So from the science side, from the tracking and evaluating side, I think we're at a really exciting point where, to Marissa's point earlier, maybe I'll avoid the word holistic, but a more complete understanding of what is happening in these MPAs, how they're set up for success, and how we can continue to support that. So for that reason, I'm really excited for the panel discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten. And so this is a great segue into Sarah. Can you, Sarah, tell us a little bit about your work? Why is it important that we know what we are protecting, and how do we assess those elements that we are protecting?
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here and really excited for the discussion. So when we think about marine protected areas, the goal is not just to protect the physical space, but also to protect the organisms that live in that space. And that marine biodiversity is what I study. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how marine biodiversity science and biodiversity monitoring can inform marine protected area management, both current management and future planning, so that we can be really strategic about where we place these marine protected areas. And so basically thinking about how we need to know where biodiversity is before, or in concert with being able to protect it. So I'm the lead author on a study that's in review right now, which Kirsten is also a co-author on, where we developed a framework for assessing marine biodiversity, both in protected and unprotected waters. And this framework has a few different aspects. So we look at biodiversity components. These are components that are not just ecologically important, but also socially important, culturally important. And we use a number of different metrics in order to assess those biodiversity components and look at all of this within the network of marine protected areas, both the national network and also smaller regional networks. And so I wanted to show you guys a little bit of data today. This is some preliminary data where we applied our framework to the United States EEZ. And this is using species presence data from OBIS, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System. And we found that when we look at the entire EEZ, all US waters, we can see the number of species that are present within the OBIS data set, and that's that blue line at the top there. And then when we look at how representative the biodiversity within the MPAs in the US, so the green line is, we see that only a half of the species found in all of our protected, or all of our US waters, are actually found within marine protected areas. And then speaking to Kirsten's point about looking at different levels of protection, if we look at the fully protected areas, we see that only a quarter of species within the US EEZ are actually found in those fully protected areas. And so this is a analysis that likely overestimates protection, but it is a great starting point for thinking about how data can inform our placement of additional protected areas and our management of current protected areas. And it shows us a lot of the work that we have to do in terms of protecting biodiversity, but also the work that we have to do in terms of learning about biodiversity, because this is obviously not actually representative of all the species, all of the unknown species that are present in the US EEZ. So there's a lot of gaps in terms of not just protection, but also knowledge, and those are exciting places for us to invest future efforts in.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. And so I'm going to come back to our agency representatives towards the end, so I'm going to skip over and go to Naya. And Naya, you come here with at least 2 hats. So my question for you as you introduce yourself is, what does large-scale marine management and protection bring to the table? And how does culture and community, how are culture and community impacted by sites that are so vast and so remote? So we're bringing the people back in, my favorite part.
Yeah, well, the image that you guys see on the slide, first I will have to thank my colleagues at Papahanaumokuakea. I'm borrowing their image. But right here you see this next generation of wayfinders or non-instrument navigators actually in Papahanaumokuakea looking at Mokumanamana. And there's been really a renaissance, a cultural renaissance in Hawaii. But from a cultural perspective, the word for future is like va mahope, which brings in the past. It's almost like back to the future. And culturally, the whole idea is you need to know your past in order to navigate forward, both from the sense that you don't want to repeat mistakes, but also because you're building on successes as well, right? And so large scale, I'm going to bring up the slide here. So, if you're taking photos, like this is not a current projection of all large scale marine protected areas, because I don't want you to focus on like exactly what that is. This is from like 2020. So this is 32 or so large scale marine protected areas. So just look at the visual for a second in terms of how that fills up the Pacific. Most of them are out to EEZs, so they're really including whole communities, right? And so it's really it's as much of a cultural landscape as it is an ocean landscape or a conservation landscape. And specific to the U.S., I would say that Papahanaumokuakea really was like the first large-scale and large-scale remote marine protected area in the world. So in 1975, you have the Great Barrier Reef, but it was not conceived of as a marine protected area in the way that we're speaking about them today. And so it took 25 years until 2000, for the U.S. when it created the Coral Reef Ecosystem Reserve to really take protection, right, to that large scale. And then we also have the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument and Marianas Trench Marine National Monument. And so, the U.S. really does have a tradition. If we look back to the past, right, of setting that stage, we were looking at going large scale. And of all of these sites, they are all connected culturally to communities. And even though there have been challenges, there have been ongoing efforts to engage community, to really incorporate culture. And so if we go back to this slide here, Papahanaumokuakea has Mai Kapolmai, which they recently released, which is a complete step-down plan created with the Native Hawaiian community in terms of having specific cultural research in Papahanaumokuakea. So I think, for the future, it really is about the past. It's building on a foundation that we have already started. And so the legacy to me is really going back to the communities, looking at the management plans that we've already created, and really moving forward with, I think, what we would all determine like is kind of the best of the best and the lessons that we've learned. And I would say all of those lessons, if we really look at them, we don't need to be concerned maybe that we're going to leave anyone out, because those lessons are clear in terms of what happens when you do. And there's really been a lot of effort made to be inclusive and equitable, and large scale in that sense, I think, brings it also to the global stage. So the next thing that I want to make sure that you guys really think about is, of the 17,000, right? If the US has 1,000 marine protected areas, but in the globe there's 17,000 marine protected areas, and of the ocean that we protect, more than 90% of that is because of these large-scale sites right here. So whether you want to say it's 33 or 35 or 40, depending upon how you count a large-scale site, scale and size matter, and the U.S. is a definite player in this realm. And so I think we have a lot to put forth, and specific to the Pacific remote islands. If that expansion, that the idea of potentially expanding, is successful, that actually helps us reach that 30 by 2030 mark.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jenny, I believe we're going to have an image coming up here. Vecina colombiana. Tell us a little bit about your work at the aquarium and your work in general with wild waters and conservation.
Yes, buenas tardes. Chiba Uswe, that's the language of my Chibcha ancestors, so I'm so grateful that you talked about the past. And welcome and hello from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, land of the Costanoan Ohlone Esselen people. At the Monterey Bay Aquarium, we are striving very hard to work with the future advocates of the ocean. I see some in the audience today, and it fills my heart to see also the ethnic, racial, gender diversity that many years ago was not present, and so I'm grateful for that. We also are striving to make sure that we who are here facilitating the work for these younger advocates are not in their place. In other words, we are facilitating and allowing them to have the imagination of the future, letting them and their desires, their dreams, really be the drivers of how to facilitate the future of ocean conservation and ocean maintenance and management. So one of the things that drives me consistently is the people that I do this for. And it's hard to see because they're kind of all jumbled, but I grew up on the far left-hand corner in that building in Paterson, New Jersey, a very urban community. For those of you that are as old as I am, will remember the movie with Morgan Freeman about Lean on Me, and that is the town I grew up, the city I grew up in. So the idea of ocean only came when the 2 weeks a year my mother took off from the factory to go and take us to the Jersey Shore. And that's the accent right there. And that's when I would see my first animals. And that's when I fell in love with the ocean, honestly, through TV and watching it through TV. When you hear a lot of us who are environmentalists and you talk to us, many environmentalists are like, oh, I love it when my dad and my mom used to take me hiking, or when my mom and my dad or my family went kayaking. I never had that experience. As an urban dweller for the majority of my childhood, my experience with nature and connecting with it was television. And so I want to change that. I want that to be different. And so I do it for the kids that are excited when they see a jelly. This is one of our Head Start programs, working with, in partnership with 2 counties of Head Start, and they come and visit the aquarium to learn more about the ocean. I do it for the young women that were young like me and didn't know, how the heck do I become a scientist? And their parents had no idea about how to tell them how to become a scientist. Or maybe their first language is Spanish, and maybe science was not the easiest thing for them because no one could explain to them at home anything beyond 5th grade science. Even though they tried, they could only go so far. I do it for them. I do it for my racially combined family that has a lot of different generations, a lot of different gender expressions, a lot of different political expressions. I do it for them because I don't think the ocean is one that discriminates. And so I do it for these young faces, and I have to say probably this picture is a little bit on the older side. I believe that girl in the middle is probably about 15 now. But it does remind me the impact that places like aquariums and zoos, marine protected areas, they actually make such an impact. And this happened to me while I was in Oregon. I was visiting a Carl's Jr., and I had taught a Head Start kid a very long time ago, and I remember her name was very distinct. She was so chatty, and I walked into this Carl's Jr. and I saw this young girl. I go, wow, I haven't seen that name in a decade at least. And she's like, oh, I go, but you probably wouldn't know her because I'm from California. That's where I did the program. She goes, oh, no, I grew up in Salinas, California. It turned out to be that very same girl. And she, not living close to the ocean, even though she was in Oregon, still remembered her visit to the aquarium when she was a child. So these are important, impactful moments that while people may not continue to visit them, hits them in a very core center of their identity. Hits them because it speaks to their ancestral backgrounds, the connections that we all had. Whether we grew up in nature or not, we know that inside of us, we are part of it. We are no longer separate from it. So I do it for these spaces that are now 15 and maybe older, that are making the changes that we need, that have the mindsets that we need to make the future happen.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jenny. And let's see, Shannon, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how your work at the Department of the Interior and how it relates to the session today on wild waters and conservation?
Yes, of course, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to just start with just a personal note. So I'm a fifth-generation Floridian, born like all of my grandparents in Key West. And for any of you out in the audience, and I'm sure there are many of you who grew up on an island, particularly on a small island, you spent a lot of time on the water. And I just want to note that my earliest lessons in conservation and nature were taught to me by the ocean. And so I am grateful on both a professional and a personal level for everyone in this room and up on this stage with me who has worked so hard to not just to understand our oceans, but to protect them. So thank all of you. During my Senate confirmation process, Senator Whitehouse suggested to me that a reasonable person might be able to expect to guess at the mission of an organization by its name, but that such a person might be sorely misled by the Department of the Interior, given our equities on the coast and in estuarine and in marine environments are so substantial. And I have a slide, I don't know if we can get it up there, that lists some of these equities. I oversee, as the Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks, I oversee the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. So in my portfolio alone, we're talking 34 million acres in 88 marine and coastal national parks, 183 marine and coastal national wildlife refuges, and more than 855 million acres in national marine monuments and national wildlife refuges. So, and then not to mention the stewardship and management responsibilities that we have in the interior, in river watersheds, urban watersheds, peatlands, wetlands, coastal wetlands, all of which have a significant impact on ocean health. And in fact, the ocean and the health of the ocean really affects nearly every aspect of environmental health in our planet. And is the health of our oceans obviously incredibly vulnerable to climate change, and in particular. And so, we've talked about America the Beautiful, sometimes called 30 by 30. We think of it as America the Beautiful. I am so incredibly grateful and proud to serve a president and in an administration that understands the importance of conservation as a tool to address the most significant crises of our time, of our age: climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of nature, and then the deep injustices that occur from inequity, the built-in inequities that we have in terms of human access to nature, which is, a lot of what you're talking about. And so it's been said, it bears repeating, that the president has set the first ever national conservation goal 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. Not only did he tell us what to do, he told us how to do it. By really lifting up locally led and voluntary conservation, he gave us the principles to do it. And those principles are based and grounded in decades of experience. Those of us who have been doing conservation for a long time know that the most durable conservation is that which is grounded in community. It's that which brings to it an all-hands-on-deck kind of ethic, and that's the way we're pursuing America the Beautiful. I also want to mention something that hasn't been mentioned here, which is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, because that law too, that incredibly, really generational investment in the nation's infrastructure it also has a big recognition of the importance of ecosystems and resilience. $1.4 billion in ecosystem restoration and resilience is part of that bill, and it's going to help Interior collaborate with states and tribes and local governments and communities to invest heavily in large-scale ecosystem restoration, habitat connectivity, and the like, all of which, as I said, whether we're working in the interior or on the coast, will ultimately help with with ocean resilience and health. I'm so pleased that you told your story about growing up in New Jersey, because we are thinking as expansively as we can about where conservation gains can and should be realized. And as I said, large-scale ecosystem restoration is an obvious place that we need to be concentrating and investing in. My entire career was spent restoring the Everglades, for goodness sake. That's what I grew up doing, is restoring large-scale ecosystems. But we recognize that it is as important and there are incredible conservation gains to be gained in lots of other places, including urban environments, urban watersheds. Interior has a number of programs that have been around for a really long time. It's just getting them, building the connective tissue between them, and then leveraging them against each other and aligning them to deliver for communities and for ecosystems. So I'm just going to name a few of these programs just to have them, and if you've got a pen, you can write them down if you're interested. But things like the Urban Wildlife Refuge Program, the Urban Bird Treaty City Program. Your city can become an urban bird treaty city if it would like to. The Outdoor Restoration Legacy Program, which is designed to increase recreational access to underserved communities. We are building swimming pools in heat islands like Austin and communities that don't have access to a place to swim when it's 105 degrees. The Outdoor Restoration, the Rivers Trails Conservation Assistance Program, and many others aimed at urban watershed restoration, increased and more equitable access to nature. This is a picture of the Bayou Sauvage Urban National Wildlife Refuge in Louisiana. We just expanded it in December to increase access to the residents of New Orleans. It is a 15-minute drive down the interstate, down I-10 from New Orleans. And this is where folks can learn about the importance of coastal wetlands in ocean health and marine health. The last thing I want to say before closing is how excited we are about the fact that just a couple of hours ago, Secretary Haaland just issued a secretarial order designed to phase out single-use plastics on all Department of the Interior managed lands over the coming decade. And thank you. And this is in recognition, obviously, of the crisis particularly to marine environments, but to all wildlife that single-use plastics presents. And if you go online, check out the secretarial order, what you'll see is that we really are trying to deeply hardwire the reduction of single-use plastics into the business practices of our agency. This is a durable approach. It's an approach that is practical, that if you are running an organization of 30,000 employees and you're managing millions of acres of land, this is the way you're going to get rid of single-use plastics in your organization. So with that, I thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. Thanks, everyone, for your introductions. So what I've heard here, in addition to these wonderful announcements from NOAA and from the Department of the Interior, is that this idea of conservation includes both people and biodiversity. And we tend to have this as a binary, as a separate thing. So I want to ask our panelists, each of you, what kinds of actions do we need to do in order to meet the moment, meet this opportunity to integrate these two really important, seemingly disparate, right? We have our scientists over here, we have our people communities over there, and then we have agencies who have the ability and the capacity to bring it together. So I want to ask all of you, how can we bring that together so that we can really have a holistic whole ocean management? I'll start with Kristen.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm thrilled to be on this panel with all of these folks for that reason. I think first and foremost, this idea of listening and learning. I've so enjoyed these panels. Every single one, I'm walking away with a new idea of conservation, a new idea of what works and what's happening. And that's not insignificant, to be able to have these conversations and to learn from each other. So one, I think still keep on having these conversations and creating the space for them. Secondarily, I think we need to track where this is happening, and we need to be able to recognize and celebrate and tally, if you will, where things are coming together so that we get a real sense of what effectiveness is and what it looks like, so we only have so many resources to give, right? And so we need to be thinking about how we can support initiatives that are doing this. So for example, these indigenous-led sanctuary proposals, right? Like, what an amazing way to fast-track this conservation and to do it with people and nature both in mind.
Thank you. And great segue, then I wanted to ask Rick, from your perspective from NOAA, what are some of the actions that the agency is taking to bring this together?
Thank you. I'm still thinking about Shannon's question from Senator Whitehouse about recognizing an agency by its name.
Yeah, you have a problem too.
Well, yeah, so I'm here from the National Organization for the Advancement of Acronyms. And I'll try to resist too much jargon in the answer. But I think the answer is at the intersection of two different triads, if you will. And the first is the triad of science, service, and stewardship, which we talk a lot about at NOAA. And it's interesting that you talked about science and the conservation pieces. So at NOAA, if you look at our mission and the mission component of the various components of NOAA, it's really all about, first of all, getting the science right, which means collecting the data, developing the predictive models, deriving products in an applied sense. But it's also about recognizing the value of stewardship, sustainability, if you will. So how does the science fit into the sustainability agenda? And all of that is for naught if you don't throw in the service piece. How do we deliver the products? How do we co-develop the products? So it's not good enough to sit in the lab, do the work, develop the products, understand the application, and then, if you will, throw it over the transom to the user community, as we might call it. There has to be, from the get-go, that co-development, co-management, co-issuance of these various products. The other triad is the lives, livelihoods, lifestyles triad. And so if you think about that, let's use marine protected areas as a case study where the threat to lives, if you will, the existential threat associated with climate change is very much addressed, mitigated, potentially, by how we manage marine protected areas. Certainly when you look at blue carbon, for example, it's a component of that. It's also about livelihood. So I work for the Department of Commerce. Part of our responsibility is economic development. And we have to look maturely at the issue of how these protected areas also serve as opportunities for jobs in a very sustainable manner, context, of course. And then the lifestyles piece gets to the ethics, it gets to the recreational aspects, it gets to the quality of life component. So in each of those intersections that I alluded to, we could talk about specific programs, specific projects, but I think from a strategic standpoint, it really is about where in the Venn diagrams of science, service, and stewardship, and lives, livelihoods, and lifestyles, how we deliver on those mission requirements.
Thank you. Naya?
Yes, could I add, yes, if you caught my talk yesterday, I was talking about, doubling down on artistic literacy so that we could have the skills to have nuanced problem solving and to really grow our imagination to meet the scope and scale of the challenges we're facing. But I could apply that same thing to really looking at those communities and the cultures, and going into cultural values and cultural traditions. And for like Papahanaumokuakea, one of our taglines was where nature and culture are one, right? Instead of an either or proposition, it's a both and proposition. So how can we move away from nature or people, or conservation or extraction, top down or bottom up, agency led or community driven? And then how can we also innovate beyond this idea of integration? Not that integration is bad, but I think it's insufficient. So often we choose integration because there's an existing power imbalance that we're trying to address. And I think we end up creating outcomes that, again, aren't bad, but they're maybe not really fulfilling quite to anybody. And, I'm not saying that I have the answer, but how do we really come together to co-design, have transparent conversations, and take the time to allow those conversations not to simply include conservation, right? To have them about the connections to wider social links, and to give ourselves time to really think and digest. Like, we don't need to solve them, right, in one workshop or in a week. But how do we build relationships where we can keep the conversation going?
I love that. It's sort of a new ocean narrative, a new vision, a new perspective.
Anna, can I just add one
Yes,
quick perspective that might be a little bit different? Not different, but just different. For those of you, from a different angle, which I think that for those of you who work in government or have worked in government, I think we've got a lot of work to do inside of government. We have incredible expertise and capacity and power inside I'm going to use the word bureaucracy, but not in any way pejoratively. These are powerful organizations that can do incredible things, but they operate under certain authorities, and they operate within organizational cultures. And if we want to do things like partner with community, and we want to encourage creativity and different ways of exercising our discretion, then we need to look internally and make sure that our employees, our scientists, our managers, our leaders feel empowered to do those things and are rewarded for doing them, and feel like they have the freedom to do those things. And I'm using really general words. This is very hard work, because these are very big organizations, and they're old organizations, and they operate in a very sort of patterned way. And so it's really important that we work inside the Fish and Wildlife Service, inside NOAA, inside the Park Service, and others. They're part of the solution too.
Well, I think those are legitimate cultures, right?
Yes,
There's
right.
a community culture. There are
Right.
cultures that are intergenerational over thousands or millennia.
Right.
But right, as somebody who worked at Papahanaumokuakea, who was not like a Fed myself, but had to work with Fish and Wildlife and NOAA and the state and OHA, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, each one of those organizations had its own culture. And even though those cultures clashed, it wasn't about one being right or wrong.
Right.
They were just different.
Right.
And those conversations took years, right,
Yeah.
to move through,
That's right.
to create a management plan
And you
that
do
actually
have-
fit towards everyone.
And I do want to say, you do have leaders within your organizations. As a previous urban park ranger, I actually know the work that is being done on the urban refuges. I know the work that was done with bird treaties, and the work that was done on the coastal flyway. You have people like Angelina Yost that are doing the work. You have people like Kim Strasberg that are doing the work. Many urban park rangers that are doing it. NOAA, I've had the pleasure of serving on a grant review panel this year. I've never been impressed with the way that the questions that are being asked of grants that have never been asked of grants before, that really include community, that really talk about how is the community being done. And the next step, as we continue to work internally on those cultures, to continue to leverage cultural competency within these internal structures of the agencies, there are other things that can be done. This morning I tuned into Black marine scientists and evaluating data sets. That is such an important aspect of the work that we have yet to really talk about. We have wonderful people doing amazing work, like the two papers that were presented this morning, fantastic. And are we bringing Indigenous, Black, other people of colors, even people who are community leaders and not necessarily scientists, looking at the data, asking the questions, like you were saying, you don't have the answers, but asking the questions in a certain way that we're going to be getting to answers at a different level than we traditionally would.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I wanted to take that, so I love the piece of the institutional culture. Shannon, thank you so much for talking about that. We've heard about culture and participation of the people who rely on and live near the ocean. So Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about how, from a scientist perspective, then that same integration has to happen, right? We talk about interdisciplinarity. So may those be some challenges and opportunities for our vision, our national conservation goals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that conservation science is really moving away from this single species, this charismatic macrofauna strategy where we're focused on a species and towards thinking about ecosystems. And thinking about ecosystems, we can both broaden our vision, but also we can look at, we can kind of scale down to smaller scales. So thinking about biodiversity as not just being visible species diversity, but including microbes that are so important for ecosystem function, including invertebrates, including species that might not be as charismatic, but are really culturally important. And when we think about these ecosystems, it helps us to bring humans into the conservation idea, because we are one species that interact with multiple different ecosystems, and we can think of ourselves as part of ecosystems rather than separate from them. And the other thing that I think is really important for thinking about interdisciplinary science is the push to make data more accessible, like you were just talking about, Jenny, making this data available, having data be more collaborative with communities, community-led science, and working with indigenous scholars and people with that indigenous long-term knowledge that's so important to understanding our ecosystem. So there's definitely challenges, but there's a lot of exciting areas that we can move into.
Absolutely. And so I want to pose this question. I'm watching time. I think we have about 18 minutes. So I want to bring it back to America the Beautiful, right? We've seen some challenges. We've seen some connections across scale, across in biodiversity, looking up, looking down, integrating different perspectives, different types of knowledge. How do we get there? How do we achieve those goals? I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Maybe I'll loop it together because I wanted to return to something both Shannon and Naya said about, taking time to understand these different cultures that are at the table with these decision making. I think, it starts with relationships and a place where we can all come together and have these conversations. So CHOW has been that place. I sit in a university, and to your point, Sarah, I remember when I was developing my ecology class like 10 years ago, the idea that humans were part of ecologies was revolutionary. And now we've come so far, still far to go, but it starts with that discussion, and it takes time to talk about that, and so being able to build relationships around it. So how does that relate to America the Beautiful? We need to be having more interdisciplinary conversations. We need to have more, I would love to have some of you come and speak to my class, or to write grants together for this reason. I think also we need to devise a way that we can, as I said before, showcase all this amazing work. And I think that the Atlas for America the Beautiful is an excellent place to bring in these different types of data, different knowledge systems in our tracking. We have ways to do that, and I see that as a great opportunity.
Wonderful. And then I'll ask Jenny, how do we get there? What do we need to do to get there from your perspective?
I'm really glad you said relationships, Kirsten, because relationships when we think about it, it's not the nice, at least not in the Latino culture. You know, like the Latinx culture, we like go in there and we like love on you in ugly and lovely ways, right? And so these interdisciplinary conversations that you were also talking about, and like, I think it's about, let's talk about the intersectionality of race, gender, sexual orientation, all other different types of identities, so that we can have the ugly conversations, but it's built on our relationship of trust, that I respect you, you respect me, and we come at this because we want to go at a solution together. Will it be exactly the way I envision it? Probably not, and how wonderful. But we need to have that relationship in order for us to come across together at the table. We can't do it in our separate silos like it has been done. I don't know if anyone has shown it, but we just can't be done the way it has been done. We have to do different. And for me, I always have a lot of hope in the next generation. I see how they interact with each other. I see how they may have differences, but they transcend them. I see that there's a willingness to maybe look and even try to understand a different perspective and walk in someone else's shoes. And I say that those of us that are a little on the older side, talking to you 80s kids, we need to kind of step aside a little bit and allow some of these youth to really come forward and really start speaking their truth in ways that are different and new and innovative. So I think the next way that we have to do is start creating new dialogue, new language, conservation, that term, personally, I have an issue with it. I think there's new ways of talking about these very things that these wonderful people have been talking about. People, nature, all of it together. There has to be a new way to talk about it that is decolonized and that is powerful in a new and different way.
I love that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. I'd like to add. You know, I think what I would say is there aren't very many shortcuts. So the tension is we have a sense of urgency because we feel that we are in a crisis, and yet we know from experience, it's not like we don't know how to do this work. We've been doing it almost sort of like learning on the job for a very long time. And I think now the folks who are starting in this field have several examples they can look at it, things that were not done properly and then things that went well. I spent my entire career in one ecosystem, and yet now I'm in this job where I'm looking, I'm working across the country, and I can tell you that one ecosystem, that journey, 25 years in one place, so far I'm 18 months in, and I have not seen a single thing anywhere in the country that my 25 years didn't prepare me for. When you are trying to deeply root conservation, for the lack of a better word, when you're trying to deeply root it in community, you learn it all. You go through the whole arc. You build relationship. You make mistakes. You realize how important it is that you have this diverse range of voices. You learn a new vocabulary so that people can understand what you're talking about. You learn all of those lessons when you're deeply rooting the work, and I think as a result, it's more durable. So. The last thing I'll say is I want to echo what you've said about the next generation. I'm a Gen Xer myself. Yes. And I am convinced I am convinced that our greatest contribution to the world is Gen Z. And because I truly, I'm going to take credit for my two kids, me and my kids. They are incredible. I mean, I have a 23-year-old and an 18-year-old, and they are so much wiser than I was then. And so I am super, super hopeful.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, as the boomer on the panel. So I think, Anna, you used we in the question, what can we do? And I think there are many we's in that question. And as far as the we in the confines of this room, we're doing it, I think. There's a lot of action. You heard what various NGOs, government organizations, academic research communities are doing. The problem is, if I go back to one of my predecessors, Connie Lautenbacher, used to ask us at NOAA all the time, yeah, but how do you get the guy on the bar stool in Peoria to care about the problem? And that's another we. And so part of this is conveying the value proposition of everything we're talking about in America the Beautiful to the rest of the country, the rest of the we. I was in a meeting earlier today where I pointed out I grew up in New York City, and I knew all about Yellowstone, I knew all about Glacier, but I never visited them until I was probably 15 or 16. but I had developed a deep and abiding appreciation for these magical places. How do we do the same thing for the rest of the we, so that they understand, why is Stellwagen a magical place? Why is Cordell Bank a magical place? And that's engagement. That's also explaining the value proposition in terms of things like, here's a challenge for you. The person on the street, when you go out here, what do they care about? Well, they care about paying $6 a gallon for gasoline. Is there a connection between what we're talking about here and that problem? They care about crisis, food crises. They care about peace on the globe. What's the connection? And there are connections. That's another longer dialogue, but I think part of what we can do is help establish that value principle that relates to the things that the rest of the we's care about in the country.
I agree with that.
Or the globe, actually.
Yeah, definitely building connections, relationship, and sort of to ground it in something very specific. Naya, could you speak a little bit about co-management and how that, like, so, you know, we have to get to a certain goal, and then there's a 30% broadly defined part of that goal. So how do we get there? What are the steps from a co-management perspective that includes relationships, that includes conversations, communication, building those connections?
Well, I'm going to build off what you said, time. I mean, that's really what we need to be willing to invest as well as money. But a lot of times, whether it's, political cycles, in terms of when people, like how long they hold an office, right? People want to be able to report something and state an accomplishment. Different federal agencies have their own internal cultures, ways that report. So there's so many links, right? It's like a dominoes, and we're kind of looking here for like, what can we do here? But there's lots of different, I guess, communities, right, that we have to think about. So I think, for co-management, we already know, right? I'm not saying anything new. It's community, the federal agencies, state and local, departments. But I think the biggest thing is really time and remembering that we are a part of the ecosystem. And that, and Monica Medina was speaking to this earlier as well, that sometimes we need to go slower so that it sticks. And I know, right, we have a lot of tension, and maybe some people even have fear in terms of, we need to do something now, we need to do it quick. But I think racing forward, again, and I guess I'll go back to that Vama Hope, right? The way forward is to actually look to the past, and so much of the past, that kind of knowledge and technology was built, intergenerational knowledge and people observing for hundreds or thousands of hours. And so even though we have new technology and we can do certain things faster, other things we maybe shouldn't do faster. And so I think it's setting up expectations as we message to communities and as we message to the whole country. How do we allow ourselves to invest time and slow down and be okay with not having the outcome or the answer or like the proof tomorrow?
Can I say something about co-management?
Yes, please.
Or did you have another? So Interior, we're taking as expansive a view as we can, and we think of it as co-stewardship, because co-stewardship can include co-management, sort of formal arrangements to, that are hammered out over time and are very formal. But what we're really trying to do is broader than that, which is to imbue in each bureau, working in the culture, right? Imbue inside of each bureau an entrepreneurial sense of seeking opportunity to co-steward. So you've got examples like the return of the National Bison Range to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai. That was land that was taken, we gave it back, right? That's a really shiny example. But then there are small examples of biologists in the National Park Service working with the Dakota tribe in the Mississippi National Recreation Area to do meadow restoration, and the Dakota tribe is helping them identify native culturally significant plants. So that's traditional ecological knowledge. It's also traditional. It's traditional ways of knowing. It goes beyond knowledge. It's to the wayfaring issue. It's how do we know what we know, and just opening ourselves up to ways of knowing that are different than our traditional Western scientific method, which we are indoctrinated in from kindergarten, and figuring out all of that is encapsulated in co-stewardship as far as we're concerned.
Wonderful. And then thank you, from then the science perspective, what kind of information from the one that we've been indoctrinated into, how does that help? I mean, there's a place for it, right? So how does that help us achieve those goals?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, to your point, science is opening up and should open up and, taking down the barriers between academic science and what has traditionally been called more applied science or, management even. So breaking those barriers down is hugely important. And also recognizing that there is a place where biodiversity science can inform our actions. And so, to the point of doing things slowly, we also want to do things deliberately and strategically, and we can use the data that is already available and the data that's continuing to be made available to inform our actions and to, really think about where things need to be in order to best achieve all of our goals.
Wonderful. So to wrap the session up, I know, Kirsten, you and a team have just published a paper on the status of U.S. MPAs. So that's part of that process of getting to. So I wonder if you can very briefly sort of share from your perspective the science, the agency, the communities. How does all that play into what you see the next steps, the next 50 years of MPAs in the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it was really a privilege to collect the data that went into the analysis. So we looked at the 50 largest U.S. MPAs and looked at their stage of establishment, their level of protection. And as part of that, it's going through management plans. It's looking at the processes that have happened. It's talking to managers about what's happening in their MPA. It's looking at all the investments that have been made. It's incredible, right? We have many MPAs, and some of them are very large, as you said, Naya, like world leaders in this space. So I think it was very encouraging to see that. And we also saw areas, right, where we still have a lot of destructive activities happening in some of our MPAs. So I think this is where the conversation continues. We have a lot of opportunity to look at more than just the lines on the map, to make decisions about how to move forward. And to your point about this tension with time, right? Like, I shared those pictures because in my experience of those places, they've changed so much during the time I've been collecting data on them. And I know that most of us in this room have had that experience of seeing this change firsthand, collecting the data. The urgency is there, but for things to be durable, we need to do things right. And so I'm very hopeful about that.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up our session. I really want to thank our panelists. I think we've solved the MPA problem. Okay. I've got some good notes. I'll pass them over to you, Rick, and Shannon.
All done.
And I really want to say thank you. I think this idea, Jenny, your comment of conservation is a word we use, but it may not be the perfect word. So for lack of a better word, definitely we have those goals, and I think that with all these brilliant minds and definitely the youth. You were there you were. We have, we can be hopeful. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And again, I want to thank the administration, Shannon and Rick, for the incredible announcements today, both from the Department of Interior and from NOAA in terms of ocean conservation. And I know it's not the perfect word, but I really do want to thank you very much for the strong support that you're providing to our oceans and Great Lakes. We really appreciate it. Just for everybody else, we're going to take a short break, and then we will be back here at 3 o'clock for our final plenary, and it's not one that you want to miss. We are really fortunate to have CEQ Chair Brenda Mallory and Dr. Jane Lubchenco joining us for a seaside chat with Vicki Sproul about the path forward for our oceans and Great Lakes. Please join me once again in thanking this tremendous panel too.